Hello, and welcome to this evening's RLI Power Hour webinar titled Making the Leap, Transitioning from One Practice Setting to Another. We've got a really great all-star faculty tonight that's going to dive into this topic. So we're really excited about this evening's webinar. But before we get started, we do want to go over a few logistical items with you so that you know how to better participate in this evening's event. So when you join this evening, you join through the Zoom platform. On the Zoom control panel, which you can see an image of here, there are two icons that we want to draw your attention to. First is the chat icon. The chat icon you would use if you're having some sort of technical issue. So you click on the chat icon, up comes the chat window, you type in your technical concern, and then our staff will see it on our end and we'll reach out to you to resolve your technical issue. The second icon we want to draw your attention to is the Q&A icon. This is an icon you would click on if you have any questions that you want to ask of our faculty. You're welcome to submit questions at any point during the webinar. However, they will only be collected and not addressed until we get to the very end where we have a dedicated Q&A session. Last item that we want you to know about is that this is a recorded webinar, which will become available to our membership at a later date. And that includes the participant questions as part of the Q&A session. So I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Pyatt, my co-moderator for this evening's session, to introduce this evening's faculty. Dr. Pyatt.
Thank you, Jen, and good evening, everybody. We have three incredible faculty this evening. I'm going to give you a little brief overview on each one. Dr. Richard Duszak, MD, FACR, is professor and chair of the Department of Radiology at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, UMMC, in Jackson, Mississippi. He came to UMMC from Emory University, where he served as professor and vice chair for health policy and practice in the Department of Radiology and Imaging Sciences. He previously spent nearly 2 decades in private practice, where he served as president of a large radiology group in his home state of Pennsylvania. Dr. Toyin Idowu joined Fairfax Radiology in November 2018. For those of you not familiar with Fairfax Radiology, it is in Northern Virginia, and she is specializing in neuroimaging. Prior to joining Fairfax Radiology, she was assistant professor at Johns Hopkins Hospital and chief of neuroimaging at the Johns Hopkins Bayview Medical Center. Dr. Amy Patel is a board-certified radiologist who specializes in breast imaging. Amy is a breast radiologist medical director at the Breast Care Center at Liberty Hospital and is managing partner of Alliance Radiology. And she is also an assistant professor of radiology at the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Medicine. It is wonderful to have these three great faculty tonight. We're going to start off with Amy Patel. Amy?
Thank you very much, Dr. Pyatt, for that warm introduction. I'm going to share my screen and we can dive in. I'm sorry, can you see my screen? I lost it here.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, great. Okay. Okay, so I have been tasked to discuss the private practice versus hybrid academic setting. Of course, there are a myriad of practice types out there, but I'll specifically touch upon these two, and then perhaps in the Q&A, if there are questions for all three of us, we can most certainly address it. And of course, our esteemed additional panelists will be sharing some really wonderful information as well. These are my disclosures. So the current radiology job market, as we all know, it's no surprise. It's such a buyer's market right now. And the workforce landscape, as many of us know, has changed quite significantly since the pandemic. And as a result, many options are available to radiologists of all career levels. And particularly workplace flexibility is something that we're seeing. We're seeing many practices, regardless of practice type, offer options for, whether it's hybrid reading in-house and remotely, or reading remotely, and practices that prior to the pandemic didn't offer that. And practicing from a geographic location that maybe you need to be in for particularly family reasons or other personal reasons. So really the options are plentiful at the moment. Those practices who do not adapt, they will have difficulty recruiting, and we're seeing that. And so when we see practices that are having difficulty recruiting, regardless of whether they're academic or a hybrid private practice or even a private practice, they're really having to devise ways to make them more enticing and more appealing to the applicant these days. We're seeing higher compensation for more experienced radiologists. We're seeing an increase in retirement simultaneously. So already with the pandemic and rising volumes that seem to not abate, we also have an increase in retirements happening. So that's just adding to sort of the struggle and the strain of needing more radiologists to fill those positions. There's an increasing demand for more flexible, remote-friendly working options, like I sort of touched upon about workplace flexibility. The AAMC is actually forecasting a 42.4% growth in the population of Medicare beneficiaries by 2034. So as a result, that is only going to make us more and more in demand as radiologists, and our volumes will continue to proliferate. So Merritt Hawkins is noting that radiology now ranks as the third most requested specialty. So as a result, there is a lot of demand, as we're discussing, and there are high offers out there now for new radiologists. We're seeing signing bonuses anywhere from 10 to 50,000 plus. So quite a range. I've seen signing bonuses out there of even $100,000, particularly to areas where it's incredibly difficult to recruit. And these numbers, I've been now in practice for 6 years, and these numbers, I did not see when I was looking for a job coming out of fellowship. Stay bonuses are happening for current employees to increase their retention as well. So when it comes to practice settings, it is no surprise again that there have been so many hospital mergers, acquisitions, and partnerships, and then that's really evolved into different practice models and different practice models. So whether you have a community-based hospital being bought out by a larger institution, or you see private practices engaging in increasing joint ventures with hospital systems, or you're seeing more health systems telling private practices that, now it's time to be hospital employed. There's just so many things out there that's happening. Or particularly, like I'll talk about with the hybrid private practice setting, where we have private practices that might be serving hospital systems that are being bought out by perhaps academic institutions. And so now you found yourself in a position where you might be, private practice, but now affiliated with an academic institution, and all those responsibilities that come with the academic landscape. So with private practice on the whole, as many of us know, there typically tends to be higher compensation, although you must take into consideration benefits. So sometimes with private practices, particularly, they'll show you a number that seems very high, but you have to see from that number what percentage of that are benefits, and then compare that to perhaps maybe other practice types where the salary may not look as high, but you also need to assess, are there benefits being included in that number? Is this actually, not an inflated number like maybe another practice is showing you? So it's something to really, look at. Private practice tends to have more vacation on the whole, which can be, really helpful for those who maybe have young families who want more time off. But, in private practice on the whole, you may be expected to interpret more studies and perform more procedures. And with that, there's a myriad of private practices, whether they're RVU based, where you have to meet a certain threshold, or even non-RVU based. So my practice is more of a hybrid setting. I'm a managing partner in a private practice. We're affiliated with a hospital system that has an academic affiliation. So it is a hybrid model. We're non-RVU based, but we still receive emails of kind of where we are in comparison to our other partners, just to sort of, make sure that we know where we are and to essentially motivate us, even though we're not strictly RVU based. So there are practices out there that, of course, do that as well. There can be possibly less flexibility when it comes to staffing, particularly if you're a private practice that's smaller and maybe you have trouble recruiting. So if somebody gets sick in the practice or goes on parental leave or something like that, it can really put the others that are remaining to work, it can put them in quite a pinch. So that is something that could particularly help affect a practice that might be smaller in terms of staffing issues. In private practice, there's lots of variability in the degree of operations and ownership. So some private practices may own their own equipment. They may own outpatient facilities for diversification. They may also have partnerships or contracts with hospital systems. They may have staff. They might hire their own staff, from marketing to technologists to the payroll, billing, legal, the list goes on. Or you could be a practice, for example, such as mine, where we don't own any of our equipment. We have some outpatient facilities, but we're mostly hospital based. We don't own we don't employ anybody for marketing. The technologists are employed by our hospitals. We go through separate companies for particularly billing, for legal. And so, there's so many different layers to this, and there is a lot of variability depending on the practice. So, if you're somebody out there that's looking at a private practice, you may want to ask these questions, because there is most certainly variability with that. So when it comes to the hybrid academic setting, this is really emerging with the changing healthcare climate. Like I alluded to previously, you might be one that has found themselves in private practice for so many years, maybe hospital based, but now the hospital system might be getting bought out by an academic health system. And so now there's the whole layer of having that academic influence. Now, for some, it can be the best of both worlds, where you might be one of those who likes to teach and have that sort of component. Maybe you like to do some light clinical research, but nothing to the point of maybe a pure academic setting where you're expected to write grants and pump out X number of manuscripts per year. So this might be a good model for you. You still have a little bit of academic influence, but you still have the private practice benefits, perhaps the salary, the vacation, etc. But at times, it can be kind of difficult as well, because you're also in these settings. Still, you're required to do these things such as teaching and that kind of thing, but maximizing your work output as much as possible. So, just talking to colleagues around the country who are in this setting, it can be quite difficult to balance your academic responsibilities, teaching, that kind of thing, as well as keeping up with your clinical work. In the end, my advice is to soul search for what you like to do. If you don't like any academic components like teaching, then a pure private practice model may be for you. If you like to do a little bit of everything, including teaching, but without the pressures of applying for grants, that kind of thing, then the hybrid model may be for you. So you really need to sit down and kind of do some soul searching. And as we know, there are radiologists that might, start in one practice model and then mid-career switch to another. But really, just doing that soul searching to see what would fit with your needs is the best advice that I can give. And with that, I thank you, and I will turn it over to my next esteemed panelist. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Let me see if I can get this up and ready to go. Hopefully everyone can see that. My name is Toyin Idowu. I am a radiologist at Fairfax Radiology Consultants, and it is based in Virginia. Previously, I spent time at Johns Hopkins for about 5-6 years, and then I transitioned to private practice at Fairfax in Virginia. So I'm going to sort of highlight some of the things that were relevant to my transition from the academic setting to the private practice setting. I have no disclosures. So some of this is really going to piggyback on what Dr. Patel just discussed in her own PowerPoint in terms of the differences between the academic and private practice setting. What I actually want to highlight, similar to what she was saying, is that in this day and age for radiology, the academic versus private practice has sort of blurred. There is not necessarily pure academic, pure private practice to the extent of what we previously knew. A lot of times in this day and age, you have academic practices that have features of some of what we traditionally thought were private practice settings. And similarly in private practice, have some features that might overlap with what you typically think are academic practices. So when you're looking at a practice, you really want to evaluate whether it's academic or private practice, some of these different things. For instance, you want to look at the work environment. You want to see if it's the kind of practice where you have the flexibility to work on-site versus off-site. Some people might be looking for that flexibility to work completely at home. You might want to look at if you're working with other people or if you're going to be working by yourself. Typically in academic practices, you get to work with different other colleagues, attendings, residents, fellows, that kind of thing. That's less likely in the private practice setting where you might be working by yourself. And some people feel like, okay, I don't have the ability to bounce things off of others as easily as I want to. But you can also be in a bigger private practice that has a lot of people in that particular section or group where you do have the ability to bounce ideas or questions off of other people. So this kind of thing can be practice specific. Same thing with shift flexibility. You might be at the kind of practice that's large enough for you to work a certain amount of time per week, 80%, 100%, 50%, or you might be at the kind of practice that is really strict with the type of hours that they want to work. That can vary both in academic and private practice, typically a little bit easier with academic practices, but these are just questions that you want to ask about the potential work environment that you're looking at. Next thing, clinical expectations. In academic practices, again, it is more common to be subspecialized in reading within your own particular subspecialty. In the past, private practices might have been more generalized where you were reading lots of different things. And there are private practices that exist out there where you're reading body, neuro, emergency, doing fluoro, the whole entire shebang, including mammo or IR. So you're gonna need to figure out, does your practice prefer that type of model versus a subspecialty model? So my particular practice, for instance, I'm at a practice where I am neuroradiology subspecialized and all I read is neuroradiology. So I don't do anything outside of my specialty. You can find private practices like that if that is what you prefer. If you prefer to read more things, you would look at different types of practices. Work volumes and call, again, those lines have blurred so much. I remember coming from my previous practice into this private practice setting and realizing that I read a similar amount in volume at a certain point. That has changed. In my private practice, I'm reading a lot more, but I think across the board in radiology, we're seeing an increase in volume expectations. I don't think that's specific to my practice or area, but you want to get an idea of what those work volumes are going to be, what the expectations are in terms of how many studies you're reading per day, if there are RVU expectations, and how much call you're taking, how many weekends of call you're taking. Research, publication, teaching, that's typically something that might be associated with academic practices. You want to figure out if that's going to be an expectation. That can be something that is, something you're looking for, applying for grants, applying for research grants, that kind of thing. In the private practice setting, it's less likely for that to be an expectation, particularly with higher volumes. But for instance, in my practice, we're associated with a local university medical school, UVA. We have rotating residents and rotating fellows that come and spend some time with us. but it can be difficult to balance the clinical expectations with that teaching expectation. And so again, you might want to figure out if this is a practice that would work for you in that context. Salary tends to be a little bit higher with private practices. That line can be blurred though, again, depending on the amount of time expectation for work and volumes. Sometimes the number can be closer than you think. So it's a question of just asking. One of the things to really get a grasp of is salary RVU based? Some practices, the RVU number doesn't matter. Other practices, you have to hit a certain RVU to get a base salary, and you get bonuses based on hitting higher targets above that RVU base. That's not all practices, and that can be either academic or private practice. My previous academic practice had sort of an RVU base that typically everybody hit, and you got bonuses based on RVUs above that. So that doesn't necessarily have to be academic versus private, but you want to ask those questions. And if you're in a subspecialty that is higher RVU values, reading higher RVU value studies, that's versus lesser RVU value studies, something to take in consideration. And when it comes to your salary, as Dr. Patel previously mentioned also, you want to get a big picture of your total compensation. You might have a whole lot of vacation weeks, but you also might have a whole lot of call weekends. So you want to balance that out and figure out what is the true cost and what is that, what am I really getting? You want to ask about retirement. You want to ask about if there's any educational funds or CME funds. These are all things that come into your total compensation. And so you want to have a good idea of all of that. And finally, when it comes to practice, whether it's academic or private, you want to understand the practice structure and ownership and what they value as a practice. And so, certain practices value the RVUs, the numbers, and the money. Other practices, value the teaching and the research, and they allow their clinicians to have some leeway to pursue that in the context of the clinical reading. So you want to understand that component. And of course, another big thing that's come into play is, PE, which is private equity groups, which sometimes can own practices. And that is something also you want to understand if that is a component of the practice and how that affects you and what your individual voice is in that context. So, questions about the structure of the practice are something that you're going to want to pursue before you sign on any dotted line. So speaking specifically to the component of going from one setting to another, particularly from the academic setting to the private practice setting, these are some of the things that you're going to do, as you're getting ready to leave. These are some of the things that you're going to know you need to do, before you give your notice. You want to understand your contract, how much time of notice you need to give to your department, and hopefully you have a good relationship with whatever department you're part of so that you can give them that information and make a plan for your departure. If you can, assist with your transition plan. If they have notice, maybe they're going to start to interview people that you can help in that process, or teach in that process to fill your shoes. If you're going to a new practice that might want you to focus on a specific area, you might use some of the time that you have left before you depart to touch up on a particular subspecialty area. You might do, focus on 3 months of neuro, or, if you have that ability, depending on if you're, a fellow about to depart, or even if you're an attending, you might have time to be able to sit in other areas and touch up on a particular specialty that you can bring to your new group. And this will be a continued theme. I always say express gratitude, show the group that you're with that you are grateful for having had the experience of working with your colleagues. I mean, this kind of stuff goes a long way. Radiology world is small, particularly in certain areas of the country. And, getting your next job and the next job after that, if that happens, is really can be highly dependent on the relationships you have with other radiologists and colleagues. So, keep those things positive. In the process of saying your goodbyes, you want to close out your projects and make sure you provide some method of being able to stay in touch. get in touch with the department, sort of, whoever your secretary is or somebody like that, give them your updated email, take advantage of the protocols that you currently have, particularly if you like them. Anytime you're going to a new place, they like to hear fresh ideas or fresh thoughts on, what were you doing at your previous place? Was it good? Was it helpful? So that can be in the range of, different MR protocols in terms of templates, because templates are becoming a big thing in terms of productivity, or even just thoughts on ways you take advantage of getting times down for scanning, that kind of thing. Or new methods, dual energy CT was a big thing when I was leaving, or perfusion imaging in stroke, these kind of things. If you have some information to provide to your new practice that you can bring from your previous practice, that can be helpful. And just try and stay engaged to the end. Just because you're leaving doesn't mean that your job is done. Make sure you finish the job, and again, maintain those good connections. In terms of staying in touch, I mentioned providing that updated contact information. One of the things that I have loved doing with Hopkins, my previous place of employment, was going back and being able to still interact with my former colleagues and interact with the residents and the fellows there. So I do that by giving visiting lectures. I do visiting lectures for the residents. I do visiting lectures for the fellows. I give board review every single year. And when I do that, I always provide my contact information and let them know that they can reach out to me. And that speaks to the mentorship part. I let the fellows and residents who are there know that, hey, you can always touch base, particularly if you're interested in practices in my area, because I just went through that thing maybe 5 years before you did, or 10. But the last thing I'll mention is, even when you move to your next practice, try to keep going to conferences so you can touch base with other colleagues and, stay on top of things and stay on top of what's new. If you have the opportunity to go to your subspecialty conferences, do it. And make sure if you're there, you say hi to the people that and let them, grab some drinks or grab dinner, whatever it may be, and just touch base, because those connections can be important. So that is the gist of sort of staying in touch when you go to a new practice, particularly academic to private. Hopefully that's been helpful. And then I'll stop my screen here.
Hopefully I have the right screen up. Somebody yell at me if I am not showing the correct display one. Okay, well, thanks. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this evening. I think I wound up getting a little bit of the cleanup crew topic this evening, perhaps because I've changed jobs more than anyone else on the panel. So I've taken a little bit of a self-deprecating title here from the perspectives from a professional wanderer. And I'm going to take a little bit of a more circumspect and perhaps philosophical approach on just thinking about jobs, thinking about staying professionally satisfied throughout the entirety of your career. And, I like this Tolkien quote, "Not all those who wander are lost." And I've done a bit of wandering through my career, been in a couple private practices, started up a health policy research institute, been in a more private academic practice and headed up a research institute there. And now I'm chair of a department at a state university with a really quite underserved population. So I've been around quite a bit, and hopefully have some thoughts from a point of view of future-proofing your career. My title about Built to Last, and I'll be pulling a few quotes from a few of my favorite books here, really relates to Jim Collins. If you like reading in the genre, has a lot of good thoughts about visionary companies, visionary leadership, but I also see a lot of messages from a point of view of visionary self-development and making sure that your career is satisfying and built to last. One thing we do know, and Dr. Patel alluded to this a little bit, is what I've been referring to is almost the Brownian motion in the radiologist workforce. When Dr. Pyatt, and certainly when I joined our private practices, the culture back some 30 years ago for me was you stay with the practice for your life. The world has changed quite considerably. This is some work led by our team, Stefan Santavica, a few years ago, looking at sort of that Brownian motion within the radiologist workforce, showing that the most recent year we had data for, that was about 2017, 2018, 20% of all radiologists were changing jobs every year. And so I think we need to be increasingly thinking about preparing for change and setting yourself up for success. I like to quote Darwin a bit whenever I'm talking about adaptation, and with apologies to him, we'll take this quote that it's not the strongest of radiologists that succeeds, nor the most intelligent, but the one that's most responsive to change. And so I would suggest to all of you, having been around the block longer than most folks that you've seen on the screen here this evening, is to prepare yourself for success. Prepare yourself to be able to adapt. Prepare yourself to be able to change. We all know too many people who've just gotten burnt out and said, you know what, I'm done. I need to retire. Do I have enough money? And they're just counting the days and counting the dollars. The question is, how do you do that? How do you create professional resiliency? How do you create a situation for yourself that when you see one of those opportunities, that whether it's Amy or Toyin has said, you know what, this is the right move for me to jump to. And I think a lot of that is knowing yourself and really doing some of that self-reflection that Dr. Patel talked about early along. Be prepared, do some of that in advance. So when the opportunities come, because the opportunities will be coming in this market, it is, as you heard this evening, a buyer's market. Think about what it is that are going to be the characteristics that you're going to use in your own prioritization. One of my favorite books, Simon Sinek, The Infinite Game, talking about really creating a long-term vision, more for your company, but again, for yourself. And Sinek talks about finding your just cause. I would challenge you to think about what your just cause is, where it's basically, what is the thing that drives me? What is the thing that keeps me satisfied, happy, engaged at work? Mine for me, and it continues to be an evolution, is my professional one is getting radiologists out of dark rooms and demonstrating to the world the value that we provide. And that's been a constant theme for me, whether in private or academic practice or my research or education. And so, his principles, and again, yours may not be so lofty. It may be, I just want to take really good care of patients. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just a bit discontent personally, but you want it to be service oriented. If it's money oriented, you will be burnt out. You will not like your job. You want to find a just cause that's optimistic and affirmative, something that's positive. You know what? I want to cure the world of breast cancer. I want to be the best neuroradiologist that's out there, rather than something that, I just want to work in a group long enough so that private equity doesn't take it over. You want a just cause that's resilient, something that's going to stand the test of time, not just, I just need to get our practices 3T magnet and we're done. You want something that's inclusive, other people will buy into, particularly if you take on a leadership role in your group and you're doing recruiting. And ultimately, the really great just causes, whether it's personal, professional for your company, or ones that are inspirational and idealistic, it's like, this is my message. I want to change radiology. And in some ways, unachievable, because the unachievable ones always keep you working. We hear a lot of people that provide advice about your careers, about finding your Zen. I'm going to take a tweak on that and encourage you to find your Venn. And for that, think about the Venn diagram that Jim Collins, in another one of his terrific books, Good to Great, talks about for companies, finding your sweet spot. And take that personal, because I think there's a lot of personal messages here as well. Again, he's talking about companies, but I would talk about individuals. What are you excellent at, or what can you be excellent at? You know what? I'm the best darn neuroradiologist that's out there. But you know what? I'm also really good at floral design, whatever it may be. What's your passion? What do you like doing? I like going to work and doing neuro because it's just great. I can see cool things. I can make diagnoses. But you know what? I really like putting together floral arrangements and, making weddings special. So that may be more of a passion for you in there. But importantly, what drives a lot of our careers are, where are the resources? Where do you get paid? You're not going to get paid nearly as well as a floral designer as a neuroradiologist. And so it's finding that triangle where all those things overlap. And that triangle may change for you over time. And that triangle may look very different depending upon what stage of life you are in. Do you have young kids? Are you an empty nester? Or do you want to move somewhere warm? Do you want to get more into industry? And so think about, what those types of things are that really drive you, what you're good at, and what you can get paid for. And that's not always just radiology as it normally is. Maybe it's doing it per click, maybe it's working as a partnership track. Another book that's out there, again, some of my favorites here, Who Moved My Cheese? The story about, the mice that were basically looking for the cheese that they always ate. And I took a tweak on this in a commentary in JCR a few years ago, made all of them doctors, talking about moving my films. The reality is, the mice that were successful here are the ones that didn't just go back to the cheese that, was going away. My hospital-based contract where, I don't do anything other than plain films. And suddenly there's not a job for me anymore. It's the curious people. It's the people that are scurrying, thinking about new opportunities, identifying those opportunities, being curious, that ultimately, and being willing to change, found themselves professionally, or in this case, from a point of view of eating, satisfied for a much longer time period. What I'm suggesting to you is not easy. Self-reflection is hard stuff to do. But I would propose to you that the time that you really want to be doing this is before the opportunities arise. Because again, you will get calls from headhunters. You will see ads for jobs online at the JCR website or wherever. You will have people approach you about opportunities. And so think carefully about what the rubric is that will be the criteria for you individually to say, this is something I really want to explore, or this is not for me. I'm predicting that, by the time the younger people in this call, are my age and looking through this, that we're going to see a generation of radiologists that have changed jobs on average 2, 3, maybe more times. That's the world we're living in. And I would submit to you that the alternative to this, and not finding out, letting your job change around you, is getting stuck in professional quicksand. Many of us have seen people later stages of their career, and I've got a lot of my peers that have just said, I just hate my job. My job sucks, but I'm not in a position to move. I haven't, created a position where I'm pluripotential enough to do the pivots, and they're just miserable for the rest of their career. You don't want to be this guy stuck in professional quicksand. So how do you, as I wrap up, avoid that? Well, number one, I would encourage you to be curious. Ask questions. When you hear about what's a private equity job look like? What does an independent job look like? You know what? I never really thought about academics, but I'm hearing these academic jobs now sort of have community divisions. And you know what? Maybe that's the best of both worlds. Apologies to Lewis Carroll from Alice in Wonderland, but be curious, sir. Really be deliberate about asking questions, about exploring what those options are. If you're starting to feel the slightest tinge of burnout, that you're not loving your job, you need to be doing your homework so that you don't get stuck. And there are so many radiologists who've gotten stuck. Think about your VEN, and your VEN will change over time. But where can you be excellent? What's your passion, and what will pay you? And those circles will change in size and perhaps a little bit shape. How they overlap may change, but everybody's got a VEN. And my final piece of advice is, back to Darwin, follow the cheese. Radiology is going through incredible change. We don't know what will happen with the role of nurse practitioners or artificial intelligence, corporatization, academic private hybrid affiliations. But the thing we can count on is change. And I would just encourage you to be prepared for that change. Proactively think about what the milestones are for you professionally. And I think you're going to be in a much better position to adapt. And with that, I will turn things back over the host if I can make this go away. I think I did.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank our excellent faculty this evening, Drs. Patel, Idowu, and Duszak, for your excellent talks and tips on career transitions. So I just want to remind everybody about how to submit a question. So here again is that panel I was talking about earlier. You want to click on the Q&A, type your question in, and hit send, and then I'll see it on my end and can ask it for you. We do have a few questions that have come in. Let me see here. So first question is, how do you know when it's time to go from your current practice? Could you each kind of give maybe some possibilities of what you thought when you were thinking about transitioning, or maybe what you kind of went through, some personal stories?
I'll be glad to jump in a little bit since I've gone through more practice transitions. I think the piece for me is when I'm not having fun anymore. And I don't mean to say that every day's a party at work. You know, there's going to be bad days even in a good job. There's going to be tough days even in a good job. But when you're coming home and saying, you know what, I'm not sure this is for me. Can I see myself doing this for another 5 or 10 or 20 or however many years you may have in your career? That would be the time I would say to you, and I've talked with a lot of colleagues who've been changed, where they go back and say, you know what, that's when I should have started thinking about it. The people that have gotten stuck, it's sort of, you know what, now I got to work my way out of the quicksand for me. So, you know, it was when I was in private practice and just, you know, cranking out the films and saying, this is great, I'm making a difference and I'm doing the cases and making the big bucks, because you do take a pay cut from going from private practice to academics and say, you know what, I'm not having fun. You know, there's other things I'd like to be doing. And that was the time to pivot. So I think it's knowing yourself. I think Amy said that early along, and, you know, really knowing what it is that's important to you and listening to that little voice in your head. Because, you know, if you've got a bunch of days where you're like, this wasn't a fun day, and not 1 or 2 days, but you've got serial days, I think that's the time to start doing some serious self-reflection.
Yeah, I think that those are really great points to make, you know, so you have to understand yourself and what motivates you. And you do want to be happy in your daily position at work. So that helps. I think for me also, you know, there are, you know, these practical things for certain families. At the time I was living in Washington, D.C. and commuting back to Baltimore for work. And so it became, you know, a little bit cumbersome in that regard. And I needed to find a practice that was closer to where I was localized. So some of these more everyday realistic things come up, you know, my family, my wife or husband or partner's job. Where do I need to live in a particular city, you know, in terms of picking private versus academic? I have loans, I have children's education to pay, I need to have a higher salary job. And, you know, these things shouldn't necessarily completely just guide our decision, but that, of course, in reality, they have an impact. And of course, they, you know, help us to choose where we're going to go. So again, for me, at the particular time it was a family decision that made me choose to move to a different location. But for individuals, all of these things come up, whether it's individual desires, happiness, family, all of these things are going to come into play. And if you start to think about it, start to look. Nothing stops you from starting the process of looking. You know, you don't need to necessarily make the steps immediately, but try not to stay stagnant and, you know, to stew in unhappiness or anything like that. Just start your process.
And I guess I would say a lot of, you know, I have a lot of similarities with Toyin, and I hadn't mentioned this, but I started my career out in a pure academic setting in the East Coast and in Boston, Massachusetts. And I come from very rural Missouri. So, you know, just being out of Boston, you know, not having the support system that now I have going back to the Kansas City area to practice, knowing that one day I would hopefully find a partner and want to have children, and having parents nearby I knew would be huge. And now all that is happening in my life. So I now realize how important that was to me. But a lot of it had to do with just my passions felt pretty stifled. As many of you know, I'm very involved in endeavors of advocacy. And in certain institutions, particularly academic, there's certain things you can do and you can't do when it comes to advocacy. So I was having difficulty grasping with that, because it truly is one of my career passions. It makes me tick. And there were so many things I couldn't do in my previous practice setting just for legality reasons. So that also played a huge role. goal. And I'm just the type of person where I like doing research and things like that, but not the, research isn't the focus of my career. I'm not a, I know how to write grants, but I'm not a prolific grant writer by any means. And I didn't want those pressures to really bog me down. Leadership was a huge factor as well. I wanted to lead. I knew that being where I was previously, it would be many years before a leadership position would potentially open for me. A promotion could take a long time as well. And for me, I just had a great opportunity close to home, which is a leadership position, a hybrid setting, still having that academic component. And again, like I mentioned with my slides, the best of both worlds. So again, like just echoing what the other panelists have said, you really have to do some soul searching, and doing it prior to when that opportunity arises is truly imperative. So then you know what you really want, and then you can go for it.
Perfect, thank you. Our next question is, what is the strategy if you're contemplating a job move after being in that job for a long period of time, but you have not maintained a network? Do you have any suggestions on how to try to figure out about transitioning if you don't know a lot of people anymore?
Well, I think Toyin hit the nail on the head. I think starting to go to radiology meetings and starting to meet people, I think, is a great start. We're very fortunate to have a very warm and welcoming specialty. When I was, contemplating making the leap with this job that I'm now in, it was a big undertaking as somebody who had only had 1 year of practice under their belt, and seeking mentorship and guidance is really important. I mean, one of my mentors is Dr. Duszak, and I reached out to Rich, and I also, deliberated with him. So going to meetings like, whether it's, the American College of Radiology or Rankin Ray, RLI, and just building those networks can be so imperative, because you meet like-minded individuals and leaders. They can really help guide you, particularly if you're in a part of your life where you really need some advice and guidance.
Any other comments?
There's a saying that I think the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago if you want shade. The second best time's today. And so, I think what Amy's talked about doing, I mean, she's been a network builder her entire life, and, has this Rolodex that's, big as a truck. But I think a few pieces here would be, if you're trying to catch up with it and you don't have the network, yes, start there, go to meetings, interact, connect, make phone calls. But again, I would encourage people, particularly given the younger folks on the webinar tonight, the statistical probability is you will change jobs at some point. So be proactive, get that network. And it doesn't mean you have to go to 20 meetings a year. You may pick a couple ones, something like a Rankin Ray, which tends to be much easier to interact with people than RSNA, where there's 60,000 of your closest friends. Get a couple of those networks, stay in touch with them, get coffee with them, and be prepared, because you never know when you use that network. I mean, whether it's job, whether it's other things, people, work advice, there's probably 2 people a day from some point in my life that I'm texting and saying, can I run something by you? And it's just wonderful to have that resource.
Any other comments? Okay, next question is private equity a good option in the long run with possible bankruptcy? Some private equities due to bond debt downgrades. I guess overall the question is, how do you feel about private equity as a transition?
I think that's a pretty complicated question, to say the least. Private equity comes in many shapes and forms. And so, different practices can have variable structures under PE ownership. Also, it matters, there are some people in the practice that may benefit from PE ownership, especially that initial PE sale. That might not be the same for someone coming into a PE owned practice. You might not get some of the benefits that some of the previous owners got in a potential sale or something like that. The general answer, how do I feel about it? I think that it is very complicated. The scope of PE, as I understand it right now, there is always going to be a conflict between PE, which is the ultimate goal of making money, versus sort of our clinical practice and responsibilities and individual desires as clinicians. And so we have to figure out as physicians on a whole, you know, if we want to be able to work in the PE setting where the goal is ultimately to make money. And so I think that lots of people have opinions on it. If you're going into a PE practice, you're going to have to ask a lot of questions about the structure and how it affects you individually as a person working in that context.
Any other comments? Okay, next question. How do you manage time with residents in a private practice setting? Any tips?
So, you know, specifically, we really make it a team effort, I would say, when we have trainees that are rotating through with us. So with that, it isn't just about it, and every, you know, I think hybrid setting probably structures this differently. But the way that we have it structured is it is a team effort where we do have, you know, residents spend time and medical students. We specifically at my institution have a breast radiology medical student rotation through UMKC. We also have residents that'll come through, and even undergrad students. I mean, we have quite a bit. And we'll have the technologists that are really involved as well to help with education. You know, I do regular, as the section chief, I do regular educational morning sessions with our technologists. We just talk about a topic that they want to go over, whether it's stereotomal troubleshooting or a myriad of things. And they like to learn and they like to teach as a result. So we have this culture of sort of all hands on deck, particularly with teaching and following a case anywhere from in the breast imaging world, whether it's, you know, a diagnostic and she has a mammogram, she goes to ultrasound, and then maybe a biopsy is recommended. And we have, you know, the trainees sort of go through that course. We also have sort of a multidisciplinary exposure as well, where we also have trainees spend time with breast surgery and plastics and genetics and breast oncology to sort of have the whole comprehensive picture. So I truly feel in the hybrid setting, an all hands on deck approach is really beneficial, and a multidisciplinary approach is as well. We've received really great feedback from the trainees as a result, because it's not just about the imaging, it's about the whole comprehensive experience. But again, breast imaging is a little bit different than some of the other radiology subspecialties.
Any other comments? Okay, next question is, how subspecialized is too subspecialized if you want to keep career options open?
I think that's a great question. It's something that I've been pretty passionate about. You know, particularly as later career, I've pivoted into academics where the standard is to be subspecialized. I worry that we have gotten too focused on subspecialization across the specialty, across the country to meet our patient access needs as optimally as possible. I think if you're in a major metropolitan area and there's a lot of subspecialists, then, you know, there is enough collective expertise to be able to provide service needs. But, you know, if you're in Mississippi, you know, I'm living in a state that's got a landmass bigger than the state of Pennsylvania, and not a whole lot of radiologists. You know, if you say, you know, I'm a neuroradiologist and all I do is head and neck, guess what? There's so much need from a point of view of coverage. And so I think from not only a patient access perspective, but also from a marketability perspective, if you get too narrowly subspecialized, you start narrowing your options. And I'm not saying, you know, blow away the fellowship, but I'm a big believer in sort of having a primary area and perhaps a penumbra area that sets you up to really be doing high quality work, but also some flexibility. You know, my old private practice days, you know, to have somebody say, well, I'm only going to do, you know, body imaging, but I really don't do fluoro and I really don't do plain films. You're like, how do we get you to cover call for us as well? So I think you really need to decide, am I going to be a hard and fast, big center academic? Because if you are, or if you're going into a really big group, and it sounds like Dr. Idowu's group may be like that, where that can support something like that. But if you're thinking you may be going more rural like Amy, or in a mid-sized group, I think you can potentially put yourself out of the marketplace by saying, all I do is this, because they're going to say, you know what, we just don't have a fit for you.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I agree that those are, excellent points. And so I think you have to understand where you feel like you would end up and what kind of practice you want to be at. The geography of it is a huge factor. Just as he mentioned, in different places, you might have plenty of radiology practices, plenty of people that are doing subspecialization, but you might narrow your ability to work in different areas of the country if you're purely subspecialized. But the other thing to keep in mind is, we all trained in all of these things. We're all diagnostic radiologists. If forced to, there are ways to regain those skill sets back. So don't ever feel like, oh, I've been practicing as a neuroradiologist for this many years, I can't do body anymore. We were trained in this. And if you need to move to a different site, if you are motivated, can pick up those skills again. It can be difficult, but it depends on your motivation. So, if you want to read a specific specialty, where I'm at, I read a specific specialty in a private practice setting, and that works because of the size of our group, and we can still cover call in that context, that works. But again, if I had to move to a certain place where they said, okay, you have to expand your skill set, it might be something where I'm taking some courses to revisit those areas, and I learn again.
Any other comments? Okay, next question is, how do you discreetly evaluate for new job opportunities? Do you have any suggestions on how to do that without maybe members of your current group finding out?
I mean, the ACR website clearly has, a huge listing of job postings that you can look at on a regular basis and just go through that and see what's available. So I think that's a great source. Your subspecialty might have its own particularly subspecialty career listings as well. Word of mouth is another thing. If you have colleagues at different other locations and academic centers, private practices, you can reach out, hey, are you hiring? A lot of times, especially in this job market, as we've talked about, that's really open, I am getting calls left and right. And this again speaks to maintaining connections. I get calls left and right from all over the country of former colleagues and people that I went to school with, residency, fellowship, you name it. Hey, we're looking for neuro, Toy, would you consider moving to this location? So these are a couple different ways that jobs have come across my lap, those different websites, as well as sort of word of mouth with different former colleagues.
Yeah, I think one other piece, having heard some stories of stuff flashing back to people is, don't just assume if you're having an inquiry with a group that the people there will be holding that confidential. I know of at least one person I'm thinking of just now, and I probably could think of some more, that had that initial sort of 45-minute call with a leader in the group about this. And the next thing that person's doing is calling some references and words out like, oh, Sam's looking for a job. I think, the pendulum goes the other way. There's people that are grabbing jobs right now that people aren't checking references because they're afraid, oh my God, if the group finds out, maybe they'll counteroffer and do this. But I think you need to sort of really decide up front, if what part of the question was discretion. If discretion is important to you, then I think it's fair to, when I talk with people, it's, hey, my chair doesn't know I'm looking, but I'm just looking around. I'm like, okay, dome of silence until you want it otherwise, and you can speak more freely. But I wouldn't assume confidentiality. If that's important to you, I would ask.
Yeah, I would agree with Rich. Don't just assume it'll be confidential. So if you want it strictly confidential, you can most certainly ask who you're talking to, but that is on them too, to be honest, to say that they will keep it confidential. And radiology, as we know, is a small community and people talk. When I was making the transition, you know, I was in 2 entirely different geographic locations, 2 different entirely different practice settings. So there wasn't, you know, so much back and forth of, you know, the institutions and practices knowing each other. So it made it a lot easier. But most certainly, I think, you know, you can certainly ask to keep it confidential, but it isn't necessarily going to be the case.
Any other comments? Okay, next question is, what things should you consider when applying for a teleradiology position? Anyone want to take a stab at this one?
Can you repeat that? What should?
Oh, sure. What things should you consider when applying for a teleradiology position?
Well, one of the things you really need to think about is for a teleradiology position, who are you working for? Is this a teleradiology position for a mid-sized private practice such as my practice, who is currently hiring for teleradiology, to throw that out there? But, you know, we're a mid-sized group of about 30 radiologists. So you have to think about where you're getting credentialed. So we have a lot less hospitals where we would need to credential, rather than if perhaps you work for a very large teleradiology, maybe conglomerate, where you are needing to be credentialed in multiple states and multiple facilities, and just all of the work that comes with that. I think credentialing is something that we underestimate, especially when we're looking at teleradiology jobs. Yes, these jobs are so appealing, especially you can work from anywhere and have that flexibility. But I think that credentialing part is really big, as well as knowing what the expectations are for volume. There are some teleradiologists out there that they've got to crank it to keep up their numbers and keep up with their metrics. So those would be 2 big things I would potentially be looking at when I'm looking at a teleradiology job.
I think if you've seen one teleradiology job, you've seen one teleradiology job. I mean, as Amy said, you know, it's really who you're working for in that situation. You know, are you working for, you know, private equity? Are you working for an academic center? I'm hiring too, by the way. You know, and you know, what does the compensation look like? What does the schedule look like? You know, there's some of these where you can come on and off when you want. You know, we've got, for example, an overnight where you work a week on and then you're 2 weeks off, and we've made it very attractive in time back. Some places are paying you per click. You know, some have an RVU meter, some have a threshold, and over that you get incentives. Some are paying you salary. Some you will have collegiality and you will be treated as a member of the group, whether it's a partner or a faculty member. Some you work with residents, some you don't. I mean, I think the only common thing is that, you know, your monitor is somewhere else from where the images are acquired. I think there's way more nuances to evaluating teleradiology, and a lot of it's some of the conversation that you heard from the other speakers tonight about just choosing jobs.
Any other comments? All right, so we're just a little bit past the hour, and we do want to be respectful of everyone's time this evening. So we're going to go ahead and conclude the webinar. I'm going to now turn things over to Dr. Pyatt for our closing slide. Dr. Pyatt?
Thank you, Jen. What an incredible program tonight. So many experiences, so many personal stories, so many great ideas and things to think about. I was very impressed with this program this evening, and I would like to thank our faculty. Thank you, Dr. Idowu and Dr. Patel and Dr. Duszak, for all that you've shared with our audience. This program will be recorded, and it will be available next week. And we would like to have your feedback, as you can see here on this slide. We will be sending a post-webinar survey and a recording, and we would hope that you can share this with your friends and colleagues, perhaps others that are thinking about job transitions and so forth. This program was really helpful tonight. Thank you again, faculty. The next Power Hour topic will be on wellness in the workplace, and this will be on, that date is not right. But anyhow, it is coming up. We will get the date out with our press releases. To register for it. What's that, Jen?
Tuesday, June 27th. I apologize for that.
There you go. To register for any other upcoming RLI Power Hour programs, please go to acr.org/Power Hour. And again, thank you to our faculty for a really helpful program this evening. Good night.